Welcome to the channel. Today's topic is, what colors do I need for oil painting? I mean, there's all kinds of colors on the market. Yeah, all kinds of different companies that want to sell you all kinds of colors. And each tube comes with a price tag. So how do you limit the number of colors that you are going to be painting with and be budget conscious in the process, right? So when I was first starting out, that was one of the biggest questions that I had. I really struggled with trying to get my palette down. What colors was I going to use each time that I went out to paint? What was the price tag involved with this hobby of mine? And how was I going to reduce some of this? Because like so many of you, I get seduced by it. I look at the color, I think, wow, that color would really look well. Wow, that one looks even better. Maybe I would go and experiment all the time, and then when you watch a lot of these YouTube videos, you begin to discuss, well, which company should I be painting? So yes, I want this particular color, but which company should I get that color from? And realizing that each company has a little bit different shade or take on a particular color, and so the colors don't always match up from one manufacturer to the other. And some of the videos will even tell you, oh, well, you should use Michael Harding because that's the best paint out there. It is a fantastic paint. Yes, indeed. Or Old Holland. Wonderful paint company, wonderful pigments, highly pigmented colors from each of those companies. But then you get online and you discover, oh, I'm not a professional artist. I don't know that I want to pay $200 for one tube of paint. Right? And then you add that together. If I'm going to be using 8 or 9 tubes of paint, this is a lot of money. So if you are a hobbyist who makes over $100,000, has no children, no other interest in life, and really wants to invest in all of these colors, by all means, spend as much money as you want. The paint companies will love you. All right, but most of us are on a budget. And I, like you, want to try to come up with the best possible paintings, but I want to do it in a very budget-conscious way. Because most of us who have this hobby of art would like to sell some of our paintings, and we'd like to make a profit. And how can you make a profit if you are painting with such expensive paints and your craft level, your ability level isn't there yet? Then every time you paint, you're basically losing a lot of money. Am I right? And it also doesn't help your painting process, because you know what I do? If I buy a very expensive tube of paint, I put just a little bitty dab on my palette, and then I'm afraid to even use it. And that's not going to help me grow as an artist, and it's not going to help you grow as an artist to try to paint a large canvas with just a small little dab of paint, because it's so expensive that you're worried about creating a painting that's not going to turn out, and you've wasted all of this paint. So let's get to the topic. So let me show you the colors first. All right, so the colors that I use on my palette, I use a yellow, a light yellow. Now, I did make a switch. I use Hansa Yellow Light. I have found that this produces almost every shade that I was getting with the CAD Yellow Light. One difference, CAD Yellow Light, very expensive pigment, lots of money. And also, it also contains the heavy metals, so I wanted to try to reduce that as much as possible in terms of my exposure. And I could not really tell a difference when I painted paintings using this yellow as my primary yellow color and the cadmium yellow light. Now, of course, keep in mind that Hansa Yellow has not been on the market as long as CAD Yellow Light. CAD Yellow Light has been used forever. So there are lots of paintings in every museum that have CAD Yellow Light in them. So we know that that stands the test of time. So you might argue that this is one of the modern equivalent colors, and so we don't really know how well this is going to hold up 200 years from now. But that's not going to be my problem. All right, so Hansa Yellow Light, I think, is a good alternative to the CAD Yellow Light for your palette, for your yellow. Another yellow that I use is the yellow ochre. Yellow ochre, I think, is indispensable on any palette. It just provides a nice shade. Now, of course, you can mix your own if you want to be a real minimalist and only carry one red, one yellow, one blue, and a white. You could pretty much mix anything you want from those four colors. But yellow ochre is such a convenient color to have on your palette, especially if you're going to be painting outdoors when you don't have as much time. You don't want to necessarily waste a lot of time having to mix every single color variation on the palette with such a small amount of paint. So yellow ochre. Okay, so to our reds. This is the one exception I have not found a suitable substitute for: Cad Red Light. So Cad Red Light makes a wonderful orange, and so I think it's almost indispensable on your palette, in my estimation, in my usage experience. Cad Red Light. The other red that is on my palette is an alizarin crimson. They also make this as a alizarin crimson permanent. Although I will tell you, I've used both. I know that alizarin crimson has some problems in terms of it becoming very dark. It's not a very permanent color, and artists are warned to stop using so much of it. However, I've also talked to a lot of artists who have said, I still use alizarin crimson because I have not found a substitute that really has that color. Even when it says it's a permanent alizarin crimson, it is not the same shade of red. And most of the time in which you talk about the darkening of this color is when it's not mixed. And if you are using this sparingly in your mixtures, it shouldn't be as a big of a problem. And of course, if you're making sure that you're not keeping your paintings in blasting sunlight, that should also reduce the amount that this color darkens over time. Now, if you want to be safe, by all means, look for a permanent alizarin crimson. Gamblin has a wonderful product, permanent alizarin crimson, that I think works very well, and often I will use that. Then for the blues, two blues. So you see what we're doing here. We got two yellows, two reds, and now two blues. So, and why would you do that? Usually one tends to be cooler and the other tends to be warmer. So for example, the Hansa Yellow Light, I would call this a cool yellow, kind of like a lemon yellow. And then the yellow ochre is the warmer yellow that I use on the palette. Same way here with the Cad Red Light. And then the, what I would say is warmer is alizarin crimson. And then for the blues, we got ultramarine blue, which I would consider the warmer blue. Some may not. You see, all this is relative, right, in terms of how it relates to the other colors on your palette. The second blue on the palette is the phthalo blue. All right, so phthalo blue to me is a cooler blue, and you'll notice something. These two I've gotten smaller tubes. These are the 37 milliliter. The other tubes are 150, and that's because these are what we might refer to as power colors. You want to use these rather sparingly because otherwise it will contaminate your other mixtures. All right, and now for a couple other colors that are on my palette. The burnt sienna. So burnt sienna, I often sketch in this, and it's good for certain mixtures. Burnt sienna, good color. The other one, and the one if you really wanted to reduce this to a very minimalistic color set, you might, instead of the burnt sienna, you might want to use burnt umber. Burnt umber is also a wonderful color. It can produce all kinds of different shades for you. I think it's much more versatile than burnt sienna, actually. And even now, I'm experimenting, right? I'm still experimenting. I sometimes will take the burnt sienna totally off of my palette and just use burnt umber for the sketching in and then for my mixtures, and it works fine. The one thing that I would make you aware of, and as you paint and you grow in your experience, you'll get to understand this, is that all of these paints dry at different rates. Burnt umber dries incredibly quick. That can be an advantage, and sometimes it can be a disadvantage, right? And the other one is ivory black. I bought one. I wanted to use it, and I haven't found the need. I constantly are painting paintings, and I've got this on there, and I never know when to use it. And so I think at this point, what's happened is I've decided that ivory black really isn't something I want or need on my palette because I never reach for it. You will discover the same thing. When you experiment with these colors, there are going to be times in which you are going to naturally go to certain colors and use for your mixtures. And there will be other times in which you don't. And you will soon discover that, there's some colors I purchased, and the only reason I put them on my palette is because I bought the tube. And then that might be a good indication at some point in time to reevaluate and say, you know what, maybe I'll stick that on the shelf, and there may be an occasion once in a while in which I'll pull it back out and try to intentionally use it. Then, let's see, so we've gone through, that should be all the colors now. So we've talked about the power colors, the phthalo and cad red light. We've talked about the main ones. Oh, white. So we all need white to make our paintings. I use Gamblin's titanium white as my white color. Titanium white is usually on almost everyone's palette these days. The titanium white is like the last color to dry on the painting. And sometimes that really irritates me because it's like, okay, everything else is dry, and now we gotta wait another 5 days for the titanium white to finally harden up enough that Gamblin says I can put the varnish on there because it's all dry to the touch. Also the reason why on my palette, in the winter months especially, in the summer when you're outdoors and you're painting with this, it dries quicker. When you got that sunlight and the temperatures are right, not too much humidity, but you got the sunshine and the wind helping to dry out, because it's a chemical process, right? In terms of the drying of the paint. And you may want to go for the fast matte titanium white from Gamblin. And this stuff really does dry quick because it's got the medium mixed into it. Okay. So in fact, in the winter months, when I've got this on my palette, oftentimes I don't necessarily need to use a medium in my paint mixtures. I can pretty much just stay with the colors right out of the tube and mix from there and use this as my titanium white. It does harden up pretty quick. So mediums. So what do we use as mediums? My goodness, we could have a whole video on mediums, I guess. Maybe I will do that at some point. But in my experience with mediums, I would recommend beginners not use a bunch of them. Just learn how to paint with the colors first and only barely use medium when you need to. What I have found is that I use paint companies that make paint right out of the tube that are pretty creamy in terms of their consistency. And so they will adhere to the panels and the canvases that I'm using relatively well. They will mix up well. So I think that that would be the easiest way to really get you, because mediums also affect the color of the mixture sometimes, depending on how much you're using. And sometimes you can break down the ability of the paint to last because you've added too much of the medium into it. You're only supposed to add a very small amount into a larger mixture of the color, right? And so be careful. Read the directions. Every medium has different directions about how to use it. And you really need to study your mediums so that you're using them correctly. For example, I know a lot of artists that love to use Gamasol. That's mineral spirits, right? Mineral spirits does what? It takes paint off. Right? That's why we have it, so it can clean our brushes. But many artists will use a lot of Gamasol for their underpainting, right? So you've got a little bit of paint, you put all that Gamasol, and then you're putting that underpainting on. I worry about the fact that that is a solution that's supposed to take paint off. And you are now, in the painting process moment, doing an underpainting with that color with all this Gamasol on it, hoping that it dries relatively quickly, and then you're immediately going to paint over that. I wonder how that's going to stand up in terms of time. Will that Gamasol layer that's underneath, all the paint that you put on top of it, that worries me a little bit. Virgil Elliott probably has written on this subject too, so you may want to check him out because I can't remember quite what he said about this. But for me, I think that I would stay away from doing a lot of that. Or what I would prefer, if you're going to do underpaintings, do them ahead. Put that thin layer on there and let it completely dry in your studio. Then pack it, when you're going out to paint. And don't wait into the field and then put that underpainting on. make sure that that underpainting is totally dry before you go painting the next layer on top of it. So that way you can be sure that all that Gamsol has actually evaporated off of the substance, off of your panel, and it's not still sitting there somehow, which could mean that later on, that as it evaporates, because it's supposed to evaporate, right? So that means that if it's wet at all and you're painting over top of it, there could be the possibility, I would think at least, that as it dissolves, as it evaporates, it's going to perhaps loosen or do something to the other layers that you're putting on it. Because we, as plein air painters or alla prima painters, we're doing this in one sitting. For at least I am in my painting process. Maybe you are too, because a lot of us do this. That means that we're painting all that stuff right at that moment. Anyway, so more than you probably wanted to know for a little video about the colors that you're going to use, but a little bonus coverage today. All right, so medium, what do I use? Do I use any? Oftentimes I don't use it. Sometimes I even put it on the palette and I end up completing the entire painting, and then I look and say, oh gosh, I didn't use that pile of medium. I use Gamlen's Galkid gel sometimes, and for the problem that I have experienced with titanium white. You've probably seen other painters paint with different colors. Maybe they've added greens to it. Phthalo green's a popular one to get a really bright green. Why don't I have phthalo green on my palette? Why don't I have any green on my palette? Some use a Viridian as a green on the palette. Well, most of the artists that I really respect and like are minimalist in terms of the colors that they pick. They want you to learn how to mix your own colors. And I think that's really a crucial skill. And I'm still working on it myself. So with this limited palette of colors, the main primaries with just a couple additions, I've learned a lot about painting, how to get the mixture I want from the colors that I have. You don't have to have every color under the sun. As long as you have the primaries, you should be able to mix almost anything that you need. You don't necessarily need a tube of prepared color in this shade. And most of us don't have tons of money. Most of us don't want to have tubes of 150 milliliters laying around with exotic colors that we barely need. And then every time we paint, we're putting 20 little bitty dabs, because obviously we're not going to put as much paint if we're using 20 different tubes, are we, on the palette. But if you limit it, you'll be more intentional about putting larger piles of color on your palette, and you will become a little bit more expressive and loose about how you apply those colors to the palette. At least that's my theory. And it takes a lot of paint to make paintings, and too many of us only put a little dab on there because we're conscious of these costs. And you will have noticed that all of the paints I've shown you today are from Gamblin. There's a couple of reasons for that. It's a U.S. company. I'm an American. I think it's nice to support folks that are local, so I enjoy doing that. The other is that Gamblin only makes oils, so I know that they're very conscious about the whole process, and I think that they do a good job with their selection of paints and the quality of paint and the consistency. The 1980 line is the student grade of Gamblin. What are you doing, student grade? Well, and everybody will tell you, you should use professional colors as much as possible. And I would agree with that. You may not want to lay out that kind of cash or have that kind of cash available. This is the best grade of student paint I've seen. I've used Winsor Newton's student line as well. That's not too bad if you do not have Gamblin available to you in your country or where you're painting from. I think that although they have more chalk dust, we can talk about that at some point, than the professional grades are going to have. But sometimes that can be an advantage, because if you want to paint a little bit thicker, well, you certainly don't want to be painting with little bitty tubes that are $100. I mean, how much paint are you going to get on a canvas or a panel? How free are you going to be to use it if you're a palette knife painter, for example? My goodness, you'll go through a lot of paint. And then, of course, if you mix in some of your meetings and don't make them too thick, it shouldn't have too much cracking in the layers. You don't want that. But this is a good consistency, a good student-grade paint. So if you're looking for saving as much money as possible in the painting process, like a lot of us are at this time, I would say the 1980s is just fine. You may use a little bit more of the paint to cover the canvas because it's not the professional grade. So I wouldn't hesitate to say you could use this. Like I said, the 1980 seems to work pretty well. And I do know professional artists that will use some student grade paints. They may not tell you they're using that, but they definitely are. And I've even seen some of the videos that I've purchased to learn how to paint. And there it is. There's the Winton in their box of paints. And they're using some of the titanium white from Winton because they're saving money. You use that color more than any other for your mixtures. And so many of these artists are doing some of the same things that we would do too. And not everybody is painting all of their paintings with Old Holland and Michael Harding. Even though great paints, wouldn't stop you from buying them. Absolutely, they're great. And you may want to try them out and paint with only them. But for most of us, we're looking for a lower cost. Okay, thank you so much for watching today's content. If you enjoyed this channel, if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up and please subscribe to my channel. And I will see you in the next video.